Thank you everyone for coming along to this presentation. So as you know that the Australian Council of Social Service and the Brotherhood of St Lawrence released a report last week entitled Energy Stress in Australia, and the analysis was conducted by Associate Professor Ben Phillips from ANU. So Ben's joining me today to help give the presentation, and unfortunately Damien is an apology. He's a bit sick at the moment. I think it's a bit more than man flu, so I will excuse him on this one. But Brotherhood was an integral part in this piece of work, so I'd like to thank them for that. The way we thought we'd run this is we've got a presentation about 12 slides, I think, and we're happy to take questions as we go, and then at the end, if there's any more questions, then feel free. So just, you know, if you've got a question, just jump off mute and ask away. So now I'm just trying to work out how to make, oh, there we go. I worked out how to make the slides move. Clever. Okay, so in terms of what we're going to run through today, just quickly the background for the research and then some of the key highlights. So just talking about, Ben will run through how energy prices have risen, that it's hitting certain population groups the hardest, low-income households are worse off, and then we'll sort of run through some of the particularly vulnerable groups. We'll look a little bit at solar, and then just quickly talk about the ACOSS and Brotherhood of St Lawrence recommendations. So just in terms of the background, we thought it was, you know, we've talked a lot about rising electricity and gas prices, but, you know, the impact on households is not all equal. And so to help inform the development of appropriate policy, to understand who is most impacted, we commissioned Associate Professor Ben Phillips to do some analysis for us on the costs of energy, so electricity and gas, and we also looked at housing costs as well, just to see if there was any impact there for a range of household types. So Ben has used the household expenditure survey, and we thought it would also be good to look at the trends, so compare a decade ago to see if there has been any change in what households are paying for energy. We looked at a whole range of household types, including income, wealth levels, source of income, tenure type, family type, etc., etc. And as I mentioned, we also looked at solar as well, seeing that's grown a fair bit in the last decade. And the analysis considers actual expenditure as a share of income and takes into account household energy use and any potential rebates households might receive, so state government concessions and solar energy rebates. And I think this is an important point to make, because as we'll see, some households who are paying disproportionately more of their income, this analysis is after state energy concessions are taken into account. So if we didn't have those concessions, they'd be paying even more. And I'd like to also say that this project was funded by Energy Consumers Australia as part of its grant process for consumer advocacy and research projects. And we'd like to thank them very much for that support. All right, so I might now hand over to Ben to start running through the data.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. So I'm getting quite a bit of feedback there. Just one moment. So I'm doing it through my phone, which I'm not sure how it works. But anyway, I'll just talk, and we'll see how we go. Yeah, so the work that we did, we've obviously looked at the cost of electricity and the cost of gas. We've used the ABS survey, the household expenditure survey.
Ben, sorry, it's Kelly here. It might help if you mute the screen, because maybe...
how is that?
There should be down the bottom or the top a little bar that'll pop up.
Yeah, I've just muted it.
Okay. All right, it's not too bad. Let's see how you go.
Okay, sorry about this. So we've used the expenditure survey between 2003 and 2015, and we've had to do a little bit of work to make sure the numbers relate to 2008 and 2015. And what we found is that there wasn't a very large overall increase, which perhaps is a little surprising. And we found that overall costs for electricity and gas increased from 2.4% to 2.5% of disposable income. So that's roughly around about $2,000 per year is what the current spend would be for the average household. Obviously that varies a lot from one household to the next, but that's the average. Now, of course, actual costs in terms of, say, the price you pay per kilowatt or for gas has actually increased a lot more than that. And we found that the actual increase in electricity was around about 117% or 76% in real terms. And the gas increase was a little less than that at about 89% or 53% in real terms. So what this means is that households are using less. They're using less energy, less electricity and less gas than they used to, quite possibly because they're being more frugal, and possibly because we have had improvements in terms of household appliances. So things like air conditioning units are vastly more efficient than what they were, say, 10 or 15 or so years ago. So lights are much more efficient these days. So dryers are a lot more efficient than they used to be. That's not to say all households are using these new flash appliances that are more efficient, but on average they do tend to be. So the overall result wasn't particularly startling in terms of the increase, but there is some increase there. It would be expected that this is being driven by lower energy use. Now that, of course, may be a good thing. It may not be a good thing for households. For some households who are quite poor, it may be that they're just being more frugal, so they're not able to heat their house as well as they used to. For other households who are perhaps more high income, it probably is a good thing. They've got a new efficient air conditioning unit that uses less electricity, so that's a good thing. But it's difficult to tell from this particular survey what those actual drivers are. We can only look at overall averages. So I might go to the next page. Thanks, Kelly. Just on to the next one, thanks. Okay, I can't quite see what the bottom of that one is. I think is it income quintiles?
Yes, yeah, it is.
Okay, sure. So perhaps not surprisingly, this is quite a well-known result with utility or energy use. Low-income families do on average spend more as a share of their income than high-income families. So a low-income family, so quintile 1, which is the bottom 20% of households when you rank them by income, they currently spend about 6.4% of their income on their energy costs. And that's a bit higher than what it was 10 years ago in 2008 when it was 5.9%. When you look at middle income families, it's significantly less at about 2.8%, with barely any change on the 10 years ago. And high income families, we actually find that it would also been a very slight increase, but not a lot of difference, 1.4 to 1.5%. So quite clearly high income families, while they may spend a little more in dollar terms, the share of their disposable income is a lot lower than a low income family. And that's as you'd expect with low income families. They do spend quite a lot more money on the basics or the essentials of life. And so yeah, in terms of the raw dollar spend, the average spend for a low income family on energy was around $2,000, whereas a high income family is about $2,600. But quite clearly a high income family has a vastly higher income level than a low income family. I don't have the exact numbers here, but say a low income family in that bottom 20%, they might have an income of say $20,000 to $30,000 per year, whereas a high income family might be more like $150,000 per year. So a significant difference there. And obviously any increase in energy costs, high income families much more able to absorb that cost. And it's also easier for them to spend money and make some reductions in terms of use through either using less or buying these more efficient appliances like better air conditioning systems. Now, as I said before, there is considerable variation. In terms of how much households spend from one household to the next. I was only talking about averages, but quite clearly there's a lot of variation. So our lowest income group there was spending between 3.4% and 8.8%. So this is when you line up all the households who are low income and you look at the 25th percentile, so a quarter of a way along the distribution, they're spending around 3.4%. The median was around about 5.5%, but the top 25th percentile, or 3/4 of the way along the distribution, was spending 8.8%. So your middle 50% of households for low-income families are spending between 3.4 and 8.8%. So 8.8% is quite a large amount of money to be spending on just energy. And then when you go to, say, a middle-income family, it's a lot more tightly bound, falling between about 1.8 and 3.6%. And it's even more tightly bound for the top 20% of income households, between 1 and 2.1%, with the median there being somewhere in between. Can we move to the next chart, thanks? Can we go to the next chart, thanks, Kelly?
Sorry, must be a delay coming through.
Sorry. Okay, so this next one, we're looking here at what your main source of income is. So some households, most households in fact, their main source of income is wages and salaries. But say if you're a retiree family, your main source of income would be the pension, the age pension. We lump in with pensioners also those on disability payments and also those who are single parents receiving the parenting payment single. Then there's also families who are receiving what's called an allowance, and that would typically be either the New Start payment or the youth allowance payment for younger persons who are either students or unemployed. We also have business income, and then we also have a group called other sources, and that could be, say, superannuation payments. Or some other sources like interest on bank deposits or something like that. But your main groups are the wages and salaries, the pensions and allowances. They're the main three groups. And what we find there is that, not surprisingly, wage and salary earners tend to spend a lot less than, say, those on allowances. And that's anywhere between about 1.5 and 3.4% for a wage and salary earner household. And that's much higher, of course, for those on the pension, which is between 2.5 and 6%. And most importantly, the most concerning group there is the allowances household, which is somewhere between 3.8 and nearly 10%. So obviously 10% is a lot of money to be spending on energy costs each year. And we also find that's the group where there's been the largest increase in their costs. So that top 25% of that group has gone from 7.7% being spent on energy to nearly 10% or 9.7%. So that's the group where there's been the largest increase, and that's coming off the highest base in terms of them already spending the highest share of their incomes on energy costs. Let's go to the next one. Thanks, Kelly.
I flicked it over, it's just taking its time. Sorry, I'll be quicker.
That's okay. So the next one, so is my sound okay?
Yeah, yep, sounds good.
Okay, good. So now we're looking at family types. So we split all the households in Australia up into different family types. Many are couples with children. Many are single parents. There's lots of couple only, lots of lone persons. And then there's a group called other and what are called group households or share households. What we find there is that it's typically the single parents and the lone persons who spend the highest share of their incomes on energy costs. And this is often because, well, single parents tend to be lower income families. But lone persons, they tend to also have a lot of pensioners. So there's a lot of old age pensioners or people on disability support pension or unemployed single persons who would be included in this group. So there, this again is the range. So you split them, but you rank them within each household type. The 25th percentile is a quarter of the way along the distribution. Then there's the middle. Then there's the top 25%. So the top 25% of lone persons are spending at least 5.7%. So it's an important point that 5.7% there, that's the least that they would spend. Many will be, or all of them would be spending at least that amount. Some would be spending more than that. Some might be spending 10% or even a bit more than that. And of course, on the flip side of that, some are spending, a quarter are spending 2.1% or less. So some of them may actually be spending 1%, or a few households would actually have no energy costs at all and be at 0%, but that would be extremely rare. So again, it's the single parents and the lone person families, households, who tend to be spending the most and have the greatest variation in their energy costs. Couples with kids are somewhat lower. They also tend to be higher income families compared to single parents or couple only and lone persons, because there's often a lot of pensioners in those two categories. The other group households, they're probably the lowest actually, and don't have as much variation in their costs. Certainly with single parents, I think the vast majority, I forget the exact figure, but I think it's in the 80-something% would be dominated by women or headed by women. Certainly when you look at parenting payment single, they're almost entirely or around 95% females. So in that regard, energy costs are certainly a large issue for females. And then when we look at the range here, we're also including household costs. And this is possibly one of the most concerning charts, I think, of the report. So when you add in housing costs, particularly for allowances, you will find there's been a very dramatic increase, not just in their average or their median costs, which has probably increased. You can just see on that chart, that black dotted line, increasing from on average around 30% to around 40%. So that's concerning, but the range has also increased for that top group. So 25% of persons receiving allowances are spending at least 59% of their income on energy costs or housing costs. A couple of things that drive this is, of course, housing costs have increased substantially, as have energy costs. These are the sorts of families that probably have the least ability to make changes, so they're less likely to be able to install, say, a new air conditioning unit that might be very energy efficient. But also their income, because they're receiving, say, the New Start payment, hasn't had a real increase in all the way through this time period. In fact, even further before that. But so that group has not only has energy costs increased, but their incomes have not increased at all in terms of real increases or after you adjust for inflation, whereas other groups have had some increase in their incomes. So that was a particularly concerning area. Interestingly, you don't find pensioners there. Once you include housing costs, you don't find their costs are greater than other groups, and that's because they often own their house outright. Whereas the other groups, like say wage and salary or business owners, they'll tend to have a mortgage or be renting. So I think some interesting results there. It's the allowance groups that's particularly concerning. Now we move on to solar. Thank you. So we found some interesting results with solar, perhaps in some ways a little surprising. We did find that in terms of income, there wasn't a huge amount of difference in terms of the take-up of solar panels, and that seems to be mostly related to wealth. So we did find that the take-up by wealth was considerably lower for low wealth families, but low income families, there wasn't a lot of difference. Now, I suspect this could be because there may well be a lot of older households who are perhaps reasonably high wealth, but low income. So particularly pensioners perhaps who do have the solar panels. So their income is low, but their wealth might be somewhat higher than other families. So what we're looking at here is the total energy costs, electricity and gas for families with solar panels and without solar panels. And you find that there's around about a $500 difference or so when you look at the difference there, or about $600 for high income families, and around about $400 to $500 for low-income families. So there's some reasonable savings. It may well be expected that some households that do use solar, because they've got cheaper bills, they're more inclined to use more energy. So that might be a bit of an explanation there, why the savings are not larger than that. But certainly there are still savings that are being made there. And the savings are a little bit larger for the higher income groups. And I think they're even larger again for the higher wealth groups, which I don't think may be shown on the next chart.
So, Ben, I think that's it for the data. Does anyone have questions? I can flick back to slides if people want to, but now's probably a good opportunity to ask Ben questions about the data and the findings.
Yeah, it's Rebecca here from ACOSS. I just had a question about the slide which does the segmentation by the main source of income. And just noted that for those whose main source of income is salary and wages, so that first sort of grouping there, I'm very interested in that sort of very low variability in that cohort, and wondering if you could comment on that in terms of what that says about that hypothesis of the working poor and that being a cohort that might struggle with energy use.
Yeah. So I think the reason why there's so little variation with wage and salaries compared to allowances is that what's really driving that is that you see they tend to have quite high incomes, the wage and salaries, compared to other groups, whereas energy costs are a little more stable. So you might find that a wage and salary household will spend somewhere between $1,500 a year and say $3,000 per year, but their incomes will be substantially higher than that, so somewhere between $80,000 and maybe $200,000. Whereas you'll find with the allowances, there's probably their expenditure still varies quite a bit, but their incomes tend to be quite stable and quite low. So you tend to get a higher share as a result of that. So I think that's what drives the lack of variability for the wages and salaries compared to the allowances.
Yeah, I was just wondering if that kind of masks the effect.
Low incomes for the allowance households, so that the share can easily vary between 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, or even 10%, because their incomes are quite low.
And Ben, correct me if I'm wrong. It's probably fair to say that that 3.4% figure is the 75th percentile, so the top 25% are paying 3.4% or more. So within that 25% group, you may get people paying up to 5 and 6%. But we didn't look at what the upper of that range was, because you start getting outliers there, and you're better off not going looking at the outliers. But that doesn't mean that there's not within that top 25% some much higher variability. Would that be right, Ben?
That's correct, yes. You certainly will find there will be some that will be well above 3.4%. But sometimes they don't always make a lot of sense. So particularly for, say, the business families, you'll find that some of them will have no income, but they'll obviously still have energy costs, and it might be that low income is only temporary. So we're a little bit cautious in not showing too much of the distribution. I think what we've got there is a fairly sensible representation of how the numbers sit, but having the extreme outliers, we didn't think made a lot of sense.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, that's certainly very interesting, especially when you overlay it with the other graphs showing the housing expenditure added in as well. You kind of just get that continuation of the effect with the allowances being disproportionately.
That's right.
Other questions for Ben?
Hi Ben, it's Kit Scott here from the End Homelessness Alliance in Western Australia.
Hello.
Thanks for the presentation and the important work done in this space. My question is from the people who learn differently. So this is important research that's been done, but let's say for the lay person, or if you to take this information into people waiting into a Centrelink office or people who are homeless, how can it be relayed in their language?
Good question. I must say, when we were doing this work, I was talking to a particular journalist who I think deals with these sorts of topics quite regularly, and they found it quite challenging to understand. So I think in that particular environment, you're right, it would be quite, certainly would be quite challenging to explain what it all means.
Yes.
I'm not sure I have a good answer for you, unfortunately. I think the basic take-home points that I would say, which hopefully would be understandable to those who are, I guess, really struggling, is that certainly energy costs for very low-income families can be very high. No doubt there are things that can be done that can reduce those costs, and many families have done that. But of course, that's not always going to be possible for some of these families, particularly those who have got extremely low incomes, or they might be living in say a rental accommodation where they're limited in what they can do. So I think for those sorts of families, it's quite a challenge for those families in terms of what they can actually do, given that they are financially challenged and physically challenged, in that, say, if you're living in rental accommodation, there's often not a lot that you can do to improve the energy efficiency of the house.
And Kit, it's Kelly here. I guess the point that ACOSS and Brotherhood of St. Lawrence are making, and of course many of my colleagues in the community sector, is that, we hear a lot about reducing electricity prices through the supply chain, which is critical, and we need to do that. But we also need to be looking at how to improve households' capacity to pay, because clearly that's an issue that's come through in this data. I mean, reducing the price is still not going to reduce the disproportionate amount of income that low-income households are paying, and also how to help reduce the size of the bill, and that goes to that energy efficiency and solar question that I think Ben's mentioned a couple of times.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just I spend quite a bit of time in Centrelink offices, and if you to take this information to people waiting in Centrelink offices who are already in there asking or needing help to get their financial needs met, I'm just looking at ways of how we can have a better system so that people aren't struggling and then begging to get their financial needs met.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'll come back to some of that in a minute. But I'll see if there's any other questions anyone else had of Ben. Okay, so no questions so far, but feel free again once we've talked about some of the recommendations to jump in and ask questions. So in the report itself, there was quite a few more recommendations than what I've put in this slide. But, as I just mentioned to Kit there, it's pretty clear that some households, in particular low-income households, are paying significantly more of their income on energy, and that gap has increased since 2008, and that this is contributing to the growth in inequality and poverty. And again, as I just said then, that I guess one of the key messages that many of us in the community sector have been talking about is that we not only need to focus on reducing energy price for everyone, but also the size of household bills and improving people's capacity to pay if we're going to, reduce this disproportionate amount that low-income households pay, and make it more equitable. I mean, energy, I think we need to remember that energy is an essential service, and it is quite outrageous that that low-income households are having to pay more for what is an essential service and what is really important to, you know, be able to participate in the economy and education and bring up kids and a family. So some of the key policy recommendations that we sort of talked about in the report, and I think the first one is really important, is establishing an energy poverty benchmark, which no person should fall below to access energy. We currently don't have an energy poverty benchmark in Australia. I mean, there have been reports in the past that have figures like 10% or around 7%, and that's based on some international, benchmarks that have been used in other countries. But you really can't bring in a benchmark from another country into Australia because it's quite different, the energy system, and I think it's really important that we establish an energy poverty benchmark in Australia, and then I think it helps focus on what needs to be done for those households that fall below that. So that's one of our first recommendations. The second one goes to reducing prices across the supply chain. We absolutely need to do that, not just for low-income households, but business as well. It's, just a critical part of a better functioning economy. And certainly some of the recommendations that the ACCC made in their report in July had some good recommendations in there that ACOSS and others are supporting. We'd like to see a little bit more work done in some areas and good consultation to make sure it's done correctly. But, key areas for us are in networks, where most of your bill comes from the cost of networks, and certainly write-down of assets would be a key one for us. Also, wholesale generation, we really wanted to have in place an emission reductions mechanism that would bring investment certainty into the market and help prices down there. So we're a bit disappointed that the National Energy Guarantee fell over. I mean, there are other issues that we had with that, but we thought that they were quite resolvable. So we still think we need some sort of emission reductions mechanism to provide investment certainty there. Certainly changes in the retail market, and we'll probably talk about one of those in a second. And then demand response, we think is quite a good way to help reduce the overall costs of the energy system, and we're really pleased to see that there's some work happening in that space. Then I guess, going to the point about beyond energy prices, how do we improve people's capacity to pay? The key one for ACOSS and many of the community sector is increasing the New Start and related allowances by at least $75 a week. And, you would have heard Cass and others talk about the fact that New Start hasn't effectively increased in roughly, 25 years now. It's $39 a day, and just increasingly we're seeing older people who are being put on New Start because they've been made redundant for work. They can't find work. No one wants to employ an older person, and they're having to struggle on this income for months, if not years. And it's just not good enough, and I think that comes through in the results. And in particular, sole parents are another, that they come off parenting payment onto New Start once their youngest child turns 8. And if you've been out of the workforce that long, it's really hard to get back in. And we're finding a lot of sole parents struggling on New Start to feed, clothe their family. So that's a key one for us. I think improving energy concessions would also go to that improving capacity to pay. A lot of the state-based ACOSS and other organisations in the sector have been talking about a shift to percentage-based concessions. Most states, except for Victoria, have a flat rate, which doesn't help larger families that have children and use more energy, they actually get less out of a flat rate system and struggle a lot more. So shifting to percentage base is much fairer and can help a larger number of families. So we're certainly looking at what that can look like, and it was one of the recommendations made by the ACCC. Considering regulated retail prices is another thing we're wanting to look a little bit more closely at. It was also a recommendation out of the ACCC report, and in Victoria they're also having a conversation around a basic service offer, which is similar to the regulated retail price. I guess some people describe it as one is a cap, the regulated retail price, that you shouldn't go over, but there can be competition below, and a basic service offer is often described as a floor. So, you know, we're interested in investigating those ideas a little bit more, and perhaps something targeted to low-income households might be helpful. In terms of the size of household bills, I guess, you know, two things that can help there are around energy concessions, energy efficiency, and I guess one of the key things that that quite a few of us have been calling for is mandatory energy efficiency standards for rental homes. We see this as a really big issue. At the moment, there's no incentive for landlords to improve the efficiency of homes, and we know that there's quite a lot of low-income households living in rental properties, around 40%, but it's higher when you get into people on New Start allowance, for example. It's as high as 69%, I think. And they just have no control then in terms of improving the energy efficiency of their home. And you can certainly save a lot from energy efficiency measures in terms of your bill. And then the final one in that area is around solar for low-income households. So as Ben talked through in that chart, we're seeing that there are low-income households that are accessing it, but that's those that have higher wealth. And I think Ben was spot on that it's, you know, anecdotal evidence suggests that it's probably pensioners that have higher wealth that are able to afford the solar panels. And it certainly is helping them. I think my mother's one of these people that is on a pension but was lucky enough to be able to afford solar, and I think she's one of those ones that are paying zero and probably is in benefit, in positive on her energy bill, Ben. So she's one of those negative.
My pensioner parents are in the same boat.
Yeah. Yes. So, you know, they're fortunate. But, you know, there certainly is a need to prioritise solar for low-income households. And I guess the other key one that a lot of us talk about is ensuring that low-income households are not paying for the growth of solar for others. So at the moment there's, you know, subsidies going on all over the place through policies that mean that people who don't have solar and low income are actually paying for others to have solar, and we need to deal with that in a more equitable way. So that sort of gives you a bit of a rundown of some of the things that we've certainly been talking to decision makers about, and, you know, I think bear out in terms of results of this research. So I might stop there for the moment and just see if there's any other questions about what I've just talked about, and you know, and also any more questions for Ben. Don't be shy.
Hi, Kelly. It's Emma here.
Hi, Emma.
Hi, and hi, Ben. Thank you very much for the report and the presentation. I think it's terrific because we do have this recurring issue that crops up every now and then, which, you know, says that, oh, you know, energy expenditures are really low proportion of everyone's incomes. You know, they just take an average figure. So I think it's terrific to have this data to rebut those views. Just wanted to make that general comment. With the recommendation around developing a measure of energy hardship or poverty, or I forget how you term it, Kelly. Do you have any ideas on sort of what that might look like? It is sort of somewhat arbitrary, isn't it, sort of picking a percentage figure. And it doesn't necessarily indicate whether you're struggling with energy costs or not. Do you have any thoughts on, you know, what might be useful, particularly in light of, you know, the debates that have been had about the housing stress indicators that have been used for some time?
Yeah, that's a good question, Emma. And, you know, look, someone else on the phone might know a little bit more about the UK system than I do. But, you know, they've essentially come up with, it used to be, I think, 10% of your income. I understand that has changed, that they have changed that more recently. But essentially, you know, if you are paying more, then they look at improving the energy efficiency of the property, so that can bring you down further below. And there's probably other measures. Look, I think your point about it can be arbitrary, like, you know, 7, 8, 9, 10%.
Yeah.
And which is why I think, you know, rather than us lift something from another country, we'd really have to do the piece of work here in Australia about what is energy poverty in Australia and what is a useful benchmark. Yeah, so I don't have an answer, but you know, it's certainly something that ACOSS.
Yeah, and I think it's good to put out the call, because we don't have a reliable or a consistent way of addressing of measuring these things. So I think it's really worth thinking about.
Yeah.
Can I jump in?
Yep, go.
So we do very similar things with housing. So we talk about housing stress. So, and that's where we use a 30% measure, but we only do it for low-income households. And I think you can do similar things with energy, but as you point out, it is very arbitrary. There will be some who will be spending more than 10%, who that's just what they do for whatever reason. But then again, I think spending 10% is a lot of money to be spending on energy. Other measures you can look at is the financial stress measures, where they ask in these surveys whether or not you can afford to pay your energy bills. So something around interesting, and seeing how well that correlates with the 10% measure would also be useful.
Yeah, and we've got a report coming out, well, hopefully in a few weeks' time, where we've had our RMIT analyse those HILDA measures of energy hardship. And I think the interesting thing is that, well, there was a BSL report a few years ago where they looked at expenditure to income and then the financial stress measures in relation to energy, and different groups came up as in need on each measure. So there were quite different household characteristics on the income, on the expenditure to income measure and versus the hardship measures. So it's an interesting one. What's the genesis for the 30%? Oh, this is probably an offline discussion, but how did you arrive at the 30% figure for the housing stress all those years ago?
I'm not responsible for it. It's just been a long-held yardstick been used for a long time. I started doing housing research probably in the early 2000s, and it was around then, and I suspect it had been around for quite some time. Probably the standard measure is if you spend more than 30% of your disposable income, so after tax and after welfare, and you're in a low-income household, they say you're in housing stress. That's a fairly standard measure. And sometimes these things are not, they may not be a perfect measure, but they're quite useful in terms of considering how that measure has changed through time.
Yeah, that's it.
Better or worse, as opposed to whether it's in an absolute sense the correct measure or not.
Yeah.
Not that there is a perfect measure for any of these things.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting, Kelly, with this is that the group coming up as paying the most in your report, that's consistent with the groups that are coming up in our analysis of the HILDA energy hardship measures. So lone parents, sole adult households, renters. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it's good that there's consistency.
There is that consistency, yeah.
Did anyone else have a question for me or Ben?
It's just Rebecca from ACOSS again. Just on the energy poverty measures, I can probably share, Emma, with you and Kelly and anyone else who's interested, a study that Andrew Nance did for ACOSS back in, I think, about 2013 or so. So he tried to apply the UK sort of fuel poverty measurement to Australian context, and he sort of compares a few different definitions of, you know, how you would get about energy poverty. And I think the one that he used, which emerged from the UK, was a low income, high cost measure. So it kind of had two different dimensions where it looked at if the energy expenditure was above the national median, and then after that was taken away from your disposable income, if the household income still falls below the poverty line. So in that way, you know, you wouldn't be capturing those households, you know, arbitrarily in that 10% who might just be doing just quite fine and just happen to spend a lot of, you know, money on energy or whatnot. So I can share that with people who are interested.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
Thea from PIAC here. Just wondering if there's any plans to do some of this data at a state level. Be interesting to compare.
So I think in the report we do have state level data there.
Oh, you do? Okay. Sorry,
So
I haven't read the report yet.
If you go further down, there's sort of an introduction by ACOSS and BSL, then there was the research note, and there's some data in there on it.
Yeah. Thea, that data is just in terms of average, so we didn't look at, you know, income source and family type within each state, so we don't have that, although there might be an opportunity to do that for the next phase of this project. So Ben's doing, you know, following on from this, what we're wanting to do is put some policy scenarios over this data so we could see what impact a range of policy scenarios would have on reducing that disproportionate amount that low-income households are doing. So, you know, looking at things like if you increase New Start, what impact would that have? If you shifted to percentage-based concessions, for example, if you had targeted regulated retail price, oh my God, you don't want to say that too quickly, and energy efficiency. So we want to run those policy scenarios over this data, and I think we might then at that stage also look at some of the impact it would have on each state, because, you know, some of these things would look differently in the state.
Great, thank you, Kelly.
Okay, we have 4 minutes left if anyone else has a question. All right, no one's spoken up, so I'll take that as everyone's happy for now. But if you've got any other questions, please feel free to contact myself or Damien or Ben. I'm sure Ben won't mind. Thanks. Yeah, so Ben, thanks very much for doing the analysis for us, and looking forward to the next piece of work. And thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll send you a copy of the next report when that's ready.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Ben. Terrific data to have. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma.
Thank you.